Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to the week 2 of this ongoing online course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, a focus on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction. I am your instructor, Professor Avlokita Agrawal. I am an associate professor in Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. Today we are going to talk about UNFCCC. Now, before I talk about UNFCCC, we have to quickly look at what we have done in the previous week and the last lecture of the previous week. We talked about the impact of development on water, land, air and socio-economic impacts of development, and prior to that we had established the requirement, the severity of climate change happening, that it is real and there are severe risks to which a large part of the population across the globe is exposed to or is vulnerable to those risks. And for that matter, we have to reduce, we have to reverse the climate change. And the root cause of climate change, as we clearly identified through a lot of discussion and a series of studies that researchers and scientists across the world have carried out, is that greenhouse gas emissions are at the core of climate change. They are the root cause of climate change. So, what we need to do is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, today we are at a point where we already have a greenhouse gas protocol which is existing. People, companies, corporates, everybody is signing up to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they are trying to follow the GHG protocol. But where did this discussion on GHG protocol start is what we are going to take in the next 3 lectures, including today's, and we will be discussing starting with the discussion on UNFCCC, classification of parties, conference of parties, COP of UNFCCC. So, this is what we are going to cover in this lecture, followed by Kyoto Protocol tomorrow. Now, first of all, we have to understand what led to UNFCCC's creation. We have already seen several historic events, starting from the discussion about, for the first time, discussing about global warming potential of carbon dioxide as a gas, then talking about sustainable development, understanding that environment is necessary. So, it was in 1988 that IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was created. This was created with the help of UNEP and WMO, as we have already seen. And another very interesting thing that happened in 1988 was that the NASA scientist James Hansen, he testified to US Senate that global warming, which is largely due to human activity, man-made global warming, has begun. So, he testified, and if you remember in the 4th lecture of previous week, we discussed about a lot of discussion initially going around discussing whether the global warming, which was found to be really happening, is because of human activity or not. So, by this time this was clearly established that the global warming is because of human activities. So, in 1990, IPCC and Second World Climate Conference, they called for a global treaty. So, they released their first assessment report saying emissions resulting from human activities are substantially increasing. So, we talked about substantially increasing as part of the ongoing activities, that GHG emissions, they are only increasing and there is no cutting down of that. So, they invited people, countries to come together and sign a global treaty which was towards reducing the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. This was around 1990, 2 years after that, and then in December 1990, same year, US General Assembly negotiations on a framework convention began. So, there was this whole discussion which was going on. There was establishment of facts that yes, this global warming is because of human activity, is because of all is man-made, and then they started calling for a global treaty where all the countries will come together on a single platform, agree to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and then they started, UN General Assembly started negotiating on a framework convention, a common framework which everybody would follow, and this is what led to creation of UNFCCC, or United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in May 1992, and this convention was adopted in United Nations headquarters in New York. In June 1992, the same year, UNFCCC opens for signature at Rio Earth Summit, which was 20 years after the first Earth Summit, if you remember. So, this was 20 years after the first Earth Summit that UNFCCC, it opened for signatures, and it was the aim was to bring the world together. Everybody had to agree, just like Montreal Protocol, of course, slightly around the same time, but slightly later, that the world has to come together to curb greenhouse gas emissions and collectively adapt to the changing climate. So, again, remember the two-pronged approach to climate action. One was to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as mitigation strategies, policies, implementation, and two, to adapt to climate change, to become more and more resilient and adaptive, so that there is less and less loss of lives to that. So, this is how UNFCCC came into existence, and it opened for signatures. Now, what is UNFCCC? It is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was established as an international environmental treaty to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system, and the ultimately stabilizing the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So, that is the aim of UNFCCC. Initially, it was signed by 154 states at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, which is known as Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro from 3rd to 14th of June 1992. The original secretariat was in Geneva, but it eventually relocated in 1996 to Bonn, and it entered into force on 21st March 1994. Currently, the convention has almost universal membership, which means almost all the countries of the world has agreed to become parties. They are parties to this framework convention. That is, the total number currently is 199 parties, and is the parent treaty of the 2015 Paris Agreement. So, the parent treaty to the Paris Agreement is UNFCCC. And in fact, in the previous week, when we were going through the history of events and conventions and protocols that have taken place, that have been taken into action by United Nations, we saw that after UNFCCC, there have been several protocols and treaties that have been put forth. Now, if we look at the institutional framework of UNFCCC, how it works. So, we actually have three supreme governing bodies. We have one Conference of Parties. We will go over each one of these. We have Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to Kyoto Protocol, that is called CMP, and we have Conference of Parties serving as a meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So, while there are 199 parties who have agreed to sign for UNFCCC, not all of those parties have agreed to sign for Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. So, while it is the parent treaty, not which in general talks about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the environment, not all the parties have agreed to sign for Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, which are born out of UNFCCC's deliberation in different conference of parties. So, how they are working? There are permanent subsidiary bodies such as Scientific and Technological Advice Body. There is another implementation body. So, both are required. There are constituted bodies such as technical committees and expert groups which were established under the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, individually looking at a specific aim. And then there is third one, which is funds and financial entities. So, what it also governs is that different parties, so all these countries, each country is a party. So, all these parties, they contribute financially to take this agenda, to implement this agenda forward, and it also, so this particular entity, funds and financial entities, it is entrusted with the operations of the financial mechanism. How? Now, if we have a very small party, a country which is underdeveloped, developing, is very small in terms of its economic capability or its resource capability, then how can that country work towards the agenda of UNFCCC or Kyoto Protocol or say Paris Agreement? Now, for that the financial mechanisms, they have been set in place, and the more developed country pays for the implementation of the UNFCCC in these smaller countries, is the simpler understanding of that, not exactly like that, but this is how the entire UNFCCC works. If we go further in detail, for Kyoto Protocol, the conference of parties serving as the meeting of parties to Kyoto Protocol. Within that, there is again another institutional structure where we have permanent subsidiary bodies, and we have two distinct bodies. One is the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. Now, here within that body we are looking at different technological and scientific advice bodies, and we also have the implementation body. So, one is scientific advice body, other one is implementation body. Then within that we have convention bodies and Kyoto Protocol bodies. So, bodies such as compliance committee, we have adaptation committee, we have standing committee on finance. So, such smaller committees very similar to UNFCCC. So, we are looking at scientific and technical advice, the models that will be made, the projections that will be done. Then we have implementation body, what each of the signing party, those who have agreed to sign for Kyoto Protocol, how are they performing, what are the targets, what are they doing to meet the targets from policy side to implementation side. So, each country has to report, and there is a proper body which looks after the implementation progress and all. And then we have the financial aid committee. Within the technology, scientific and technological advice body, we have technology mechanism, and we also have expert groups. So, there are specifically designed expert group bodies from least developed countries expert group, because their issues and their concerns are different from the developed countries. So, then we also have financial mechanism and other arrangements where we are talking about global environmental facility, green climate fund. So, a fund was initiated, it was formed, where the concerned parties would contribute to special climate change fund, least developed countries fund, as I was mentioning to you about UNFCCC too. So, here they have specifically created funds, adaptation fund, to help the different parties in adopting the Kyoto Protocol. So, this is again, this was under the UNFCCC. So, Kyoto Protocol was born out of UNFCCC's conference of parties. Now, what is who are the parties? If we have to look at classification of parties, so all the parties who have signed for UNFCCC, they are categorized into 5 categories: Annex 1, Annex 2, non-Annex 1, there is Annex B, and there is a group of least developed countries, LDCs. Now, what are Annex 1 countries? They are developed countries like USA, UK, Russia, plus economies in transition like Ukraine, Turkey, and some part of Eastern Europe. These are all Annex 1 countries. Annex 2 countries are developed countries, for example, which is a further subset of Annex 1. These are required to provide financial and technical support to EITs and developing countries to assist them in reducing their GHG emissions. Annex B has countries with first or second round Kyoto GHG emission targets come under Annex B. So, we are talking about countries under Annex B that have compulsorily binding targets to reduce GHG emissions. Non-annex are mostly the low income developing countries that have no binding emission reduction targets. Now, why has this non-annex 1 parties been created? as we were discussing in the previous week also, that countries which have remained underdeveloped, least developed for a long time, so they can't be stopped from developing industries, from building infrastructure, from building transportation infrastructure and all that. They need to do that, and that this entire process, all these activities are bound to release greenhouse gases. There will be emissions, but they are inevitable. If the quality of life in these countries for their people, they have to be improved, there we have to allow them to still go ahead and construct, to build infrastructure, to invest in industries, produce, because they have to grow on economic and socio-cultural side. So, what happens that they have been exempted from binding regulations as far as emissions are concerned, and the Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries and also the Annex B countries, there are bindings for them, binding targets for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and the less developed countries or the underdeveloped countries, they have no binding. The last category is LDCs, least developed countries. They refer to the least developed countries, and they also have no binding on GHG reduction. So, if you look at the website of Kyoto Protocol, you will find a list of the countries which fall under each of these categories, but very clearly we understand that Annex 1, Annex 2 and Annex B, these first three, they have binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while non-Annex 1 and LDCs, they do not have any binding on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So, that is a clear distinction. Plus the Annex 1, Annex 2 and Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries, they also have a binding to provide financial and technical support to the developing countries in Annex non-Annex 1 and LDCs. So, it is not just that they have to reduce their own emissions, they also have to provide financial assistance and technical assistance to reduce GHGs in non-Annex 1 and LDCs. So, this is how the parties have been categorized, and their binding targets are also varying, which is a very fair distribution. And there was a lot of debate that ensued for almost a decade on who will do what. So, it is like all 5 friends go to a restaurant, one is capable of paying more and the other one is not as capable, and then at the end of the dinner, when we split the bill equally. But that is not a fair way of distributing the bill. So, very clearly the one who has a higher paying capacity pays for the one with a lower paying capacity is what we have essentially agreed upon here, and also the binding targets. Now, what is conference of parties? We have been talking about in the history also, the history part of this discussion on climate change and sustainable development. We talked about COP, conference of parties. What is conference of parties? So, conference of parties is actually conference of these parties which we just discussed, which are the agreeing parties. So, parties or countries which have agreed to sign for UNFCCC are the parties, and conference of parties is actually the annual conference which takes place under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which is actually the multilateral treaty. Now, these are, as we understand, conferences. These are formal meetings of conference of parties, and hence we call them COP. Now, COP, what happens in COP is that everybody comes together. In the previous year, whatever targets they have been set for each country, or whatever target each country has set for itself, it has pledged, they will come and they will share their report card, progress card. Now, what have we done? We were to implement, we were to form policies. What have we done on policy formation? What have we done on implementation? How much of greenhouse gas reduction have we achieved so far? And that is what they do together when the conference of parties takes place. So far there have been several COPs, and their major outcomes is what we are quickly going to look at. So, the third COP 3 was in 1997, which was held in Kyoto, and very clearly we should remember that Kyoto Protocol was adopted then, and it was for the first time it was legally binding for the countries who adopted the Kyoto Protocol. So, most of the time you would find that the place where this conference of party is happened, and if there is a protocol or there is a treaty or there is a framework which is adopted in that particular conference of party is named after the place where that COP happened. So, Kyoto Protocol was signed as part of the COP3 which was in 1997. After that, another significant COP which was held in 2001 in Marrakech, Morocco. So, Marrakech Accords was signed and it set the stage for ratification of Kyoto Protocol. Ratification implies that more and more people will come together and they sign the protocol. So, not just the ones who attended COP3 of 1997 in Kyoto, after that more and more people will sign, and when there is a clear majority which has signed the protocol, it is called as ratified. So, ratification of Kyoto Protocol, the Morocco one set the stage for that. COP 8 which was held a year later in 2002 in New Delhi in India, it proposed the Delhi Declaration, which was that development needs of the poorest countries be attended to. So, prior to that, it was what we have seen after just before this particular slide was where we saw the financial mechanism, the creation of funds and also creation of separate categories of LDCs and non-annex countries was also pushed as an agenda by India in 2002 when the COP was held in New Delhi in India, and the clear intent was that the underdeveloped countries, the least developed countries or developing countries need to be handheld for technology support and for financial support. So, here the idea was that the technology transfer for climate change mitigation happened from the developed countries to the less developed countries. In 2007, the COP 13 happened in Bali, Indonesia, and there was a Bali roadmap or Bali action plan which was adopted, which was on vision, mitigation, adaptation, technology and financing for mitigating climate change or achieving Kyoto Protocol. So, that was in 2007. 2008 COP was held in Poznan in Poland and adaptation fund under Kyoto Protocol was launched. So, we saw already that under the financial entities several funds have been created. Now, these have been created in one or the other of the COP. So, just as I said that technology transfer or financial support mechanism. So, each conference of party, so Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC are growing together, and every time, every year a new mechanism for implementation, better implementation and better adaptation is being created. So, adaptation fund was created, was launched in 2008 in Poland, COP 14. COP 15 Copenhagen is again very important, that developed countries they pledged up to $30 billion in fast start finance for the duration of 2010 to 2012. So, developed countries who were signing parties to Kyoto Protocol and UNFCCC, they pledged to pool in $30 billion funds. Then in COP 16 which held in 2010 and a year later in Mexico, Cancun agreement was proposed, which was to assist developing nations in dealing with climate change, and it established earlier in Poland adaptation fund was established, and then in Mexico green climate fund was established. Then in 2012, 2 years later in Doha, Qatar, COP, Doha amendment to Kyoto Protocol was adopted, proposed and adopted, which brought very clear targets, that was to reduce greenhouse emissions by 18% as compared to the 1990 base levels. So, this was the addition to the Kyoto Protocol, which is known as Doha Amendment. Then in COP 19, which was again an year later, 2013, which was held in Warsaw, Poland, Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus, which was where we were talking about the mechanism, international mechanism for loss and damage due to climate change, that was proposed and adopted. In 2015, which is again a major milestone, Paris, COP Paris 2015. So, Paris Agreement, where we talked about limiting the global temperatures well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial times. So, we discussed that, and this was what the major point, major feature of COP15 which was held in Paris. And the other important thing was that there was again an yearly pledge of $100 billion funding by rich countries, by developed countries. Now, this was a pledge. We will see how much of it has been implemented. In 2018, which was again held in Poland, there was a rule book for Paris Agreement, nations to be taken as per NDCs. Now, COP15 which was Paris Agreement talked about reducing or limiting the global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade. We are still below 2 degrees centigrade, but to limiting it, continue to limit it, plus $100 billion funding by rich countries. 2018 Poland rule book for Paris Agreement, which was signed, proposed and signed, it was talking about the actions to be taken to achieve the targets and the agenda which was set in COP15 Paris. COP26, which was in 2021 in Glasgow, UK. India, this was particularly, I am talking about what India did was it announced net zero targets for the year by the year 2070, and it called for phase down of coal based power. So, this is what India has pledged in Glasgow 2021, and in 2022 again there was a creation of new fund which was loss and damage fund. A lot of resources are lost and damaged, and so the countries need to rebuild their infrastructure and their systems. US $3.1 billion plan for early warning systems. So, we realize that more and more such climate change events, severe climate events, they continue to happen. So, while there are plans to mitigate that, but that requires for a long term action. So, simultaneously there was a proposal to set up early warning systems so that there is less and less loss to people and properties. Again, global shield financing facility for countries suffering climate disasters, that was also proposed. African Carbon Market Initiative, Action for Water Adaptation and Resilience, Mangrove Alliance, which was in partnership with India, and India's long term low emission development strategy. They were all proposed when this COP27 took place in 2022 in Egypt. Now, what we have to see here that India as a country, India, China as developing countries, they have a critical role to play. And there, while you might think that of so many COPs in COP 2021 Glasgow, we are talking about India announcing that it will become a net zero energy, net zero country by 2070. How is that such an important event or important outcome of this particular conference? Because India as a country has a lot or a very major role to play in the global scenario when we are talking about emissions, when we are talking about population, when we are talking about resource consumption, the economic aspects, all of that. Countries like India and China are having a major role to play, and that is where gradually we are seeing that while developed countries have a role to play as far as financing and support is concerned, the actual action has to take place, of course, in the developed world too, but in countries like India and China, which are home to a very large population, and also which have a lot due to this population resources to consume, huge amount of resources to consume, and also they are supplying to the world. So, manufacturing here, but supplying to the world. So, this is how conference of parties has taken place, and each conference of party had a takeaway. However, and also we also have to see that these conference of parties and UNFCCC has actually been a success, starting from 1991 where there were only 415 participants to COP21 which was in Paris. We see that there have been some close to 20,000 participants in these conferences, which implies that there is a growing consensus over this discussion on climate change, how the discussion should be taken forward, how the actions should be implemented, what actions need to be implemented, who will do what. So, all that negotiation and discussion is bringing more and more people on board, and it is really a successful agenda, successful in terms of growing voice, but unsuccessful on the account that we are still not able to curb our greenhouse gas emissions. While the countries are pledging for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, for the pledging for supporting financially, none of it is really happening on ground. So, if we look at COP26, which was held in Glasgow, we have already seen that India pledged that it will increase its non-fossil energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by 2030. It will meet 50% of its energy requirement from renewable energy. So, that is by developing the non-fossil energy capacity. It will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now, that was in 2021, to by 2030. It will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by 45% from a previous target of 35%. So, highly ambitious plan, and by 2070 India should be able to achieve a target of net zero. Now, net zero, we are referring to a balance where emissions of greenhouse gases are offset by the absorption of an equivalent amount of the amount from the atmosphere. So, we are talking about two-pronged approach. One, we will reduce the emissions by investment in technology, by making our machines, our industries, our transportation energy efficient. And two, we are looking at planting more and more trees, of developing carbon sequestration mechanisms, of creating sinks for carbon emissions. So, both. So, we are not talking that we will not generate, we will not emit any greenhouse gas, but we are talking about emitting, but then absorbing an equivalent amount with the help of atmosphere. So, we are talking about this two-pronged approach, and other than India, the pledges by top 3 emitters, that is China, it announced no new pledges, but it previously pledged net zero by 2060. So, while India is pledging to be net zero by 2070, China is pledging to be net zero by 2070, and we have to clearly understand what a net zero in this scenario mean. It does not mean shutting down all economic industrial operations, or shutting down all fossil based transportation systems or electricity or everything. No, it does not mean that. It means we will produce, but we will absorb the same amount, equal amount, through the natural systems. United States, the US touted domestic legislation to spend $555 billion to boost renewable power and electric vehicles, and it also pledged to be net zero by 2050. Now, these are some heavy targets, these are some really ambitious targets when we are saying net zero by 2050, and so much needs to be done to do that. And India, as I said, already pledged to become carbon neutral by the year 2070. What did India commit in Egypt? COP27, which was held in 2022, that India prepared an action plan which was read as India's road to net zero, and it announced its long-term strategy to transition to a low emissions pathway to become carbon neutral by 2070. So, in 2021, India pledged that we will become carbon neutral by 2070, and in 1 year it developed a roadmap of how will India become carbon neutral by 2070. So, the key milestones of this roadmap: the National Hydrogen Mission, which was launched in 2021, aims to make India a green hydrogen hub. A lot of research push, policy push is being given towards hydrogen. Then at least a 3-fold increase in nuclear capacity by 2032, which again shifts from the fossil fuels to the nuclear fuel and is greatly reducing, will be reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Achieving an ethanol blending target of 20% by 2025, that is for transportation sector. Maximizing the use of electric vehicles and increase of public transport. So, what we see as a major infrastructure push towards metros and electric bus fleet and dedicated bus lanes is a push towards this, and this is part of the roadmap to net zero. Then increased climate finance to be provided by developed nations. So, India is seeking more and more funding from developed nations under this fund to work out, to implement these targets. And the long term strategy aims to keeping global temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius and ambitiously 1.5 degrees Celsius by the century end. We are talking about 2100. So, if by 2070 countries like India, China, US and couple of other countries pledge to be net zero, we will be able to achieve the ultimate target of keeping the global temperatures well below 2 degrees centigrade. In fact, we can continue to remain at the same temperatures or maybe even go down, and this is not unachievable. This is a target which can very well be achieved if all the parties agree and also implement that diligently. So, very clearly what we have seen here is that the world is now, it has converged and there is consensus on one, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and UNFCCC has been a major player in bringing the parties together, bringing the countries and making a consensus of the world on that. So, one, greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced, net zero targets have to be achieved, that is one. The two is how will it be done. So, financing mechanism, the technical support, the expert groups. So, that is the implementation part of it. And the third part which we have seen in climate action is developing the resilience. Till we do that, we are continuing, we are going to be bombarded with all these severe climatic events, and we have to prepare ourselves to respond to that, to prepare for that. So, that is what we are doing collectively together. In the next lecture of this week, second lecture of this week, we will be talking about how Kyoto Protocol has enabled, or what Kyoto Protocol has really done to bring the people together, and specifically what agreements and what protocols have been proposed and signed as part of Kyoto Protocol, and then followed by Paris Agreement, before we really move to understanding what are greenhouse gases, how greenhouse gas protocol came into existence, and what are we agreeing to do when we say scope 1, 2 or 3 emissions. So, that is what will follow from then on. Thank you very much for joining me in this lecture. See you tomorrow again for the second lecture of week 2. Thank you very much.